everyone. My name's Will Iverson, and I'm going to give a talk on practical Maven. Just a little bit of background before we get started. I started doing software development when I was 10 years old. I've worked at Apple, Symantec. I've been doing Java ever since 1995 when I was at Symantec. Started working with Java before it was 1.0. Actually, before it was even really announced, and they were still calling it Oak, and I've been doing Java ever since. I've written 4 books on Java software development, which you can find up on Amazon, a book on Hibernate, one on real-world web services, a book on Jakarta Commons, and also a book on Java on Mac OS X. So about a year ago, I started on with a company called All Star Directories, which is located about 85 feet over that way. And so the All Star Directories, they had it's a really cool opportunity. I first came on as a consultant, and now I'm the dev manager and architect over there. And basically, they had a truly monstrous PHP application that they built by copying and pasting the code and the database over. So a couple of you are shaking your heads, which you'd say, I mean, it's actually a pretty common scenario, right? You have a startup, you get a couple guys together, they start hacking PHP. These guys just kind of went a little bit longer than you would normally expect doing that, but they got to themselves to the point where they said, well, we want to start over again with a new data model and a new Java-based architecture, build up from scratch. So of course, when I came on, that was just a fantastic opportunity, right? You know, you get to be the guy who lays down the hello world code, start from the beginning. So since this is only about a year ago, I didn't have any legacy code that I had to work to bring in, I decided to go ahead and start putting the build processes together using Maven. And part of that was, I really wanted to leverage all of the convention over code parts of Maven because I wanted to get the project up and rolling very quickly. I wanted to be able to lay down the whole directory structure, deal with dependency management, all that kind of stuff. So I've slowly been working along on that over the last year, and then as one of the things that came up about 6-8 weeks ago, I was asked to train a couple of the guys in a different department who are brand new to Java. They've been doing PHP. And it was sort of a nice opportunity for me to be able to take all the Maven stuff that we've been doing on the main projects, and be able to sit them down and have them up and running very quickly using Maven, being able to create projects, work with it, etc. So that's why I decided, when Nimrod was asking for talks, to throw that out as a topic. We've been working with it for about a year. So with that in mind, basically I've got about a solid, hardcore year's worth of experience in with Maven. I don't want to say that I know every last little thing about Maven. There's little tips and tricks that I'm going to talk about when I'm going through here. If you guys are using Maven right now, actually, quick show of hands. Who's using Maven today? Okay, great, brilliant. Well, so that means that you guys are probably going to know some stuff that I don't know, and vice versa. So as we're going through this, especially when we get towards, I'm going to do about 15-20 minutes of slides. I'm going to do a couple of demos to show you guys a couple of things. With that many people raising their hands, I think the next thing I'll do is collect questions from you guys about either ideas or tips or problems that you've had. Go ahead and throw those up on the board, and then we'll just kind of work through those. So about 15-20 minutes of slides, maybe 15-20 minutes of demo and terminal, and then we'll go ahead and do some Q&A. Does that sound like a good format? Okay. Alrighty. So first I'm going to talk a little about what Maven is, why we use it, talk a little bit about Maven Ant. I'm just going to go through some basics with jars and WAR files and kind of talk how that works. Talk a little bit about dependencies, because obviously you can't talk about Maven without talking about that. Repositories. I've got a local copy of a repository management tool called Artifactory installed on my machine, so we can take a look at that. I don't actually have a net connection, so that's part of how I'm going to use Maven without a network connection. Talk a little bit about deployment, some tooling, and then do Q&A. Some examples. So this is the definition of Maven, and software project management and comprehension tool. So what is that not? It's not a generic tool for scripting, right? It's not a like and, right? You can do all sorts of scripting tasks with and. You can do all sorts of wacky things. Maven really is about this project object model. It's basically an XML representation of a project file, right? So what's really neat about that is, historically, so I worked on Visual Cafe. I don't know if you guys remember that tool. It was an old development environment. So that tool had in it a project file that used to keep track of all of the things that you would be working with. You define your dependencies, what libraries you depended on, what options you wanted when you wanted to run the project, all of that kind of stuff in this proprietary binary format, which was kind of lame because that meant that you couldn't give it to somebody else, you couldn't use it on a different system, there was no way to do it. Use that project file in a command line option. You had to fire up the Visual Cafe GUI, which meant that your build process consisted of like Windows COM events firing off or something, right? I mean, like, good God, right? So then you could maintain two separate build files, right? So that became its own problem. So Maven really stepped in, and the idea was to replace that binary project file, right? Not to be a generic build tool. So why Maven? Well, so you start out with your jar file. That seems really easy, right? So Nimrit, you're going to be my build engineer, okay? Congratulations. So you're going to start with the jar file, right? So can you write some ant scripts for me that'll build a jar file? It won't take too long, right? Okay, oh, and that's one of the silly transitions I was going to use. So I also need to separate out my project into a test source directory and a regular directory. Can you do that for me?
Yeah.
Okay, how long is that going to take?
It's going to take a little while.
Okay.
Not too long.
Okay. Well, actually, wait. The tests need to be broken out, and they also need to be able to run a continuous integration environment. So can you adapt your script that you just wrote for me to work with Hudson? Okay. Okay, now I need it to generate documentation, JavaDoc too. You can do that, right? JavaDoc's a command line tool. You don't have to pass any funny options in for that, do you, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're going to add that to the process too? Okay. Wait, I'm also going to need a website that kind of summarizes the results from the continuous integration and the documentation that we're writing in the test cases. Can you add that to the Ant script for me?
Yeah, that gets
How long is that going to take you?
probably going to take, well, it depends on how complex it is.
Well, I want a whole site, right? It should look pretty good.
Yeah, doesn't Hudson do that?
Okay, maybe a little bit, right? Okay, by the way, actually the WAR file, we need a WAR too, right? Okay, but we still need continuous integration in the test documentation. Okay, there's only one problem with the WAR file. Yeah, that's going to need integration tests. Because it kind of, I want you to automate installing the WAR file for me into a container. Can you do that for me?
A lot of custom work.
Okay, how long?
All of that,
Yeah.
probably a week, 2 weeks, something like that.
And do you think you're going to be able to do that and keep up with your development tasks? No?
This will be a primary task for a while.
Okay, that's all you're going to get to do. Okay, well, actually, there's also dependencies, right? Because we've been checking jar files in the Subversion, which kind of sucks, but you know, now we've got a whole bunch of binaries in Subversion, so maybe we need to track that, right? Okay, and reporting, right? Because we actually also want to use this thing called Cobratura to track our code coverage. Okay, and by the way, we needed to deploy it. The binaries, we need to deploy those up. Okay, one more thing. Okay, we also have to keep track of all the resources, like all the Spring context files and all the other associated resources and junk, right? So can you handle all that?
Yeah, that's what I did.
Okay, you feeling pretty good? Okay, I just want to throw one last thing in here. Conditional builds. Okay, now you're probably ready to quit, right? It's like, I don't want to be the build guy, right? Okay, so this is why Maven is really cool, right? And when we get to the end, I'm going to talk about, we've got all of this stuff and more running on our All Star Directories project. I'm going to ask you how many lines of XML it took to build all that. Okay, so that begs the question of Maven and Ant, right? So, gentlemen in the back, you're using Ivy, right? You've got Ant, and then you're using Ivy, which helps you fetch dependencies, right? Which is really cool.
Well, I only want to say we're using Ivy. Leave it at that.
What's that?
All I can say about the Java thing is we're using Ivy.
Sure, sure. Which is cool, totally cool. And this is kind of the point, right? Is that Ant and Ivy is a really cool add-on that gives you the ability to leverage the Maven-inspired repositories, right? So it's a way to pull down all the dependencies and things. But at the core, Ant is about tooling and scripting, right? I love Ant for that. Ant's great. Our Maven scripts use Ant sometimes to call out for complex things, right? And you can do it the other way around. You can have Ant call Maven, right? I wouldn't do too much of it back and forth, or your head will start to hurt. But they go both ways, right? So what I would suggest is that there's really is no versus, right? There's Maven, which is for projects. Most specifically, if I'm doing something that's creating one of these artifacts, right? I want a jar file, I want a WAR file. And there's this thing that I'm producing as the output of what I'm doing. Okay, then I want to use Maven. If I'm not doing that, if I'm doing something else, like maybe I'm using Ant for scripting out something like, I know some people do this cool thing where they take quartz and they have quartz kick off Ant tasks to do general purpose IT functions, right? You know, once a day. It's sort of a batch processing. Yeah, I know. There's still stuff like that. It seems like Ant. Ant is awesome for that kind of stuff. So there really is nothing here. You guys are basically buying that? Okay, now if you don't buy that, you can settle it outside. Right? But for the rest of you who want to just get your job done and get moving, Maven's cool for its thing, Ant's cool for its thing, there is no fight. That's my take on it. Okay. So if Maven is so cool and it does all this fancy stuff, which we're going to get into and talk about and do demos of later and stuff, you know, it helps me keep track of all this stuff, it helps me do my reporting and my directories and all this fancy stuff. And it gives it to me in this really nice organized way. I can say, well, here's all my directory structure, it's all laid out for me by Maven. I can perform goals with Maven. I can say, clean my project, test it, I want to put together a WAR, a jar, and deploy it. All those things are very simple with Maven. Well, the only problem is the convention part, right? Running all those conventions. Like, I'm sure if any of you have done anything with Grails, which was the last thing that Gabe and I talked about 6 months ago or so, or if you've done anything with Ruby on Rails, right, which is the other one. The only problem is that you're presented with this blinking screen with nothing on it, and it says, yeah, just know the conventions, and it all works like magic. You know, if I just type in the right command in this right place, then everything's great. That's the problem that Maven has, right? The first time you sit down and you work with Maven, and you say, okay, how do I do something? I want to do something simple like deploy something. How the heck do I do that? And you type in deploy, and then it says, oh, you're missing some element in your XML file. You say, frac, now what? Right? Okay, so then you have to go check the documentation. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's the thing that's hardest about Maven, and I would just say don't get frustrated with it. So the basics: creating a WAR, creating a jar file, linking the two of them. This is actually something I covered in the article that Nimrat sent out. Let's take a second and just sort of let's bag out for a second. So this is the source code for an example project right from the article that I had. So let's go ahead and the article really quickly. Okay, so this is the article that was linked to off the description if you didn't get a chance to read it. Basically, it walks through creating a project and then using some archetypes to create the basics. And let's just do that really quick. Let's do a quick demo. Okay. So I'm running a management tool called Artifactory in the background, but we won't worry about that for now. Sorry. Okay, so I just issued one command here, which was Maven archetype generate. So that's the only command, and in the current version of Maven, it fires it up, and then it says, what kind of archetype do you want? An archetype is basically the Maven word for a new project. And you can see all of the options that are built in. And the first ones are some of these AppFuse projects. AppFuse is a set of starter Java projects that Matt Rabel did. It's really cool if you say, hey, I've never done anything with Spring, so I want to do AppFuse Basic Spring. So I get a Hibernate Spring and Spring MVC project already set up and ready to go. And it's all done with Maven. Hey, I want to write a plugin for Maven. Or the most basic ones, I just want to do a little jar file just to get started. And there are some other ones too, like I want to do a little web app. But we're going to go ahead and take all these, we're going to take option 15, which is just the jar file, the default. And pick the default package, looks great. Okay. So this is what I just created on disk here. So I have a little app, I have the test for it, and I have a little POM file. So if we open up the POM file, I guess you can see that okay. You'll see it's defined for me the group, the artifact, the package, names, and define the dependency. Pretty straightforward. So of course I can go back in here and I can do npm clean. And use the directory. Oops. No, sorry.
So I already got a question.
Yeah, sure.
So you had to add group ID, which is meaningless.
Right.
It turns out that actually was a package.
Right. So Maven defines all dependencies with a group, an artifact, and a version. So the group is an organizational identifier. And usually you use something like your domain, right? So for SeaJUG, org.SeaJUG is a perfectly good group. And then the artifact is the specific thing that you're providing. So for us, for All Star Directories, for example, all of our group name is com.allstar directories, and our artifacts are named things like data-tier, business-logic, data-model, internal-tools, web-UI. Those are just the names that we picked for those various artifacts when we started out. So we have a simple jar file, so it seemed like it's good.
That's all part of the conventional learning curve. You got to know what those will do.
Yes, exactly. And those are that defines also how they're packaged and released as well. So yeah, absolutely, it's another piece of the learning curve. Okay. So here I am back here, and I can say, okay, MVN compile. Goes ahead, compiles the code for me. And now I have this target directory. So the target directory is where all the results appear, right? And I've got my classes. So now I'm going to do MVN site. So MVN site is a different goal. Right? So these are all goals that I'm trying to accomplish, right? So I can say, okay, yeah, it's complaining about that. So now I have a site directory, right? So what's in this site directory? Well, I have a whole website. See whatever's defined. Now there's not very much stuff defined here, although a couple things like the fact that there is a dependency on JUnit already show up for me. You can see my dependency tree. Okay. So that's a simple jar file. Now I'm going to do a little bit of a Julia Child here. What I did was in the article, which I walked through the whole example of this, here, I do what we just did, which was you create a simple business logic example. And then I go ahead and do the same thing for the web UI. Basically, I create a WAR file, and I go through the same process of defining the WAR file, and then specifying a dependency from the WAR back on the jar file. So let's look for a moment here. So this is the project that I was just working on, or the example from the book. And here you can see the little snippet of XML that I used to define the dependency. And all dependencies in Maven are defined basically this way. A group, an artifact, and a version. So this is the web app. And this is the actual business logic. So if we see up here in the root for the business logic itself, I have the fact that I have a jar file up here, and then that's brought in as a dependency into the other project. I guess everybody follows how that works? So that's all I have to do to declare a dependency. Now what's really interesting is Maven keeps track of what they call transitive dependencies. So let's say that I define a dependency over here on Hibernate, right? How many libraries are there that Hibernate depends on? 15, maybe, roughly, pick a figure. So if I just define over here a dependency on Hibernate, and I say, okay, this has dependencies, and I do the same exact thing. I define Hibernate dependencies, and these are actually, Hibernate's already defined for me. I don't even have to add that. See how JUnit, 3381, 381, that was defined for me. I didn't have to do anything, right? It just appeared. Hibernate's the same thing. Spring's the same thing. Most major projects now are all released like this. So there's already a place that you can go to just add the dependency here. This is saying it's test, but by default it would be compile. So what's cool is, by defining the dependency over here, Maven will go up, pull down the dependencies that are defined in this, and package them up and include them over here. Does that make sense? So we've got this simple example here. I'm going to try something. See if I can illustrate this. So I just removed test. So I'm kind of saying I want the JUnit jar file to actually get bundled in with business logic, right? Okay. So this is a little bit of a weird POM file that I've got right here. This is a sort of a master POM for these two pieces, the modules. And so what I've done here is I've said I want the business logic and the web app to both be able to build them in one shot. So that's what this POM file here is. So I just issued one command, and what this command did was it compiled, built, ran the tests, and then jarred and warred up the whole thing. Pretty cool, right? So, and the number of commands I issued was basically a jar file, create a jar, create a war, add the one dependency to the other, and go. So here I got this little, here I got the WAR file that came out of that. I'm going to cheat for a sec. Let's look at that WAR file. Am I blind? I just wonder. Where'd it go? Oh, there it is. I am blind. So there's that. Did I not bundle it properly? Guess I didn't bundle it properly. I didn't update the snapshot. Well, we do that every day at work. Oh. There we go. Still included. So I didn't touch my project, right? Okay. No. Anyway, not sure why the demo gods are not smiling on me right now, but I know. If I hit the right version. Oh. There we go. So it was not including it because I had declared JUnit, I think, as another dependency there. No. Let's give it one more try. There we go. So it's now including the JUnit library in for me, even though if you look over here, I didn't initially have it included. It's actually going to pull it transitively. So I can't delete this from here because of the tests needing it. And I don't want to pull another dependency in because the internet, I'm not connected to the internet.
Can't you just say it's a test for test only? It doesn't include it.
Yeah, you can define the scope. So these all have different scopes that you can bring in. So you can say it's test only. There's actually a number of different provided scopes. You can say test, which is obviously things like JUnit. We use that a lot for things like database drivers, right? We may want to say that the database driver for Hypersonic or for MySQL, we want to use that for running tests, but we don't want to actually bundle that jar file with the app. Another example is provided. So in a web application, very commonly you'll have libraries that are installed in the app server, say the shared directory, but you still want to make those libraries available for you when you're doing builds and running tests. So like the servlet jar, for example, is something where you might say that's a provided jar, but you don't actually want to bundle that into your app. Right? So there's a couple of different scopes, and then the default scope is compile. And so that's the scope that you don't have to put it on there, but that's what that you may want to add it just to be fully declarative about what you're doing. Okay. So there we go. We can see building the WAR file, hooking these pieces together. I'm going to go back into Okay, so when I was doing this demo here, I had two things that I was doing. I was basically executing goals. So goals are basically things that I want to accomplish, right? I get up in the morning and I don't say, I wanted to jar something necessarily, and I want to package it, I deploy it. So those are all referred to as goals. And they're one word. That's the easy way to distinguish what a goal when you're using a Maven goal. Now, the other thing is plugins. Goals are comprised of plugins that are bound to those goals. So obviously the default plugin that's bound to the compile is the compiler plugin, right? So the default for that is compile:compile. This is really important when we're trying to figure out what the heck is going on with Maven. Let's take a moment and flip back here. Okay. So when I issued this command, right? Any one of these commands here. So I said Maven package, for example, right? So the first thing about Maven package is I'm doing this on a multi-build, multi-project, so it's going to be a little bit more complicated. Actually, let's take a simple one here. Pick the simplest one. This is the simplest thing you can do in Maven. Okay. So what I told Maven I wanted to do was clean out my project, right? So it said, okay, I want to do a clean. The first thing that you do with clean is you run the clean plugin, right? And then that's what actually did the work. Let's do a little bit more complicated one. Okay, so what the heck's going on here? So compiling, first thing it did was it copied any resources over, and then it ran the compiler. What would be some things that might be common resources that you might need or use? What's that?
Properties files.
Bingo, property files, right? So it assumes that by default, anything that's in your resources directory, you might want to copy over as well into the target, and then the compiler would run it. Another one? Test. So tests got a little more complicated. So what's one thing that's interesting about test is you'll note that it ran resources compile, then it did test compile, test resources, test compile, and then it ran this thing called Surefire, which actually ran the test, actually runs the test. It runs the test and then it does the build. So this is probably one of the more confusing things about Maven when you're working with it. So let's say that I want to change some configuration options. Like I don't want to run all the tests. Where would I go? What would I look at? It's kind of a trick one. And some of you have been doing Maven for a while, right? So it can't be the first time.
Throw a magic -d property to the command line to specify the name of the test you want to run.
Throw a magic -d property file on
Well,
the command.
property on the command. So -d test equals and the name of the test, if I remember correctly.
That's one of them, right?
Okay.
So where would you go to find out the documentation on where the heck this weird command line option for skipping tests comes from?
The great brain in the sky, Google.
The great brain in the sky, Google, right? But what's Google going to, if eventually, where would you wind up?
It'll point you to the Maven documentation.
Maybe documentation, top level, right? What you're really going to wind up on is the documentation for the Surefire plugin. Right? Everything in Maven, all of the documentation for everything is going to basically boil down to these plugin documentation, right? So now that I've given you a hint, okay, let's say I want to do something wacky like I want to tweak. Let's say I want to do something like, okay, well, the production environment is on Java 1.4, but I want to use Java 1.5 annotations for compiling my test code because I really like JUnit annotations. Bear with me. Right? What documentation am I going to look at? The plugin for compiler, right? That's how all this stuff is getting stitched together and how all the options work. What this kind of reminds me of, and I have a vivid reminder of this because, like I said, I'm teaching some people to do Java. It's the first time you're presented with object-oriented documentation, and you've never seen it before. You've only seen procedural stuff, and you're like, where the hell are all these methods coming from? It's very similar to that, because you think that you're looking for Maven documentation, but really what you're going to be doing is you're looking at the documentation for all these different little plugins. The plugins will say, these are the goals, so that these are the actions that I support, right? So compiler says it does compile and test compile. So that's how I'm going to configure the options in the plugin, right? So I'm going to show you a more advanced example of this real quick. So this is the real world POM file for what we're doing at All Star. And if I skim down here, I can go to the plugins. And here you can see, sure enough, this is where I'm configuring the compiler plugin, right? So it's the compiler plugin, which is that compile thing. That's the documentation I'm looking for to be able to set the target, the JDK version number. Question?
Well, I don't know if you want to elaborate this now or later, but why do you put that in plugin management versus in the plugins declarations themselves?
So there's at least 3 places, right? There's build plugins, reporting plugins, and then within the plugins, there's plugins, and then there's plugin management, right? So the official documentation for this is that plugin management is where you go to configure defaults, right? So, and then plugins is where you go to mostly to bind specific executions. So you may go, what the heck did he just say? Okay.
Defaults can be handy in multi-projects, I think, if I remember correctly.
They can do what?
Can be handy in multi-projects, where you want to set it up for multiple projects and then...
Yeah. So yeah, it's for
copyrights.
yeah, it's for multi-project, and then also there's some subtle distinctions between the different goals and phases and life cycles and things, which I guess I'll talk about maybe more in a minute. I'll go through it and then go ahead and then actually ask me that question again after I go through some more of the conceptual stuff. Okay. Let's see. Oh, check on the click. Okay, so goals and plugins, right? Okay, so how do you configure all this stuff, right? So mostly what we've been looking at is the project POM file, right? So where the heck did it say that compile was even bound to compile, right? Like it says compiler compile is bound to compile. Where the heck did it define that? Well, Maven itself, in Maven, when you get Maven, when you download it, when you install Maven, which is just basically a zip file, one of the files in there is basically the master declaration for everything that's going on. And so that's where you can go and you can crack that open and look at it and see what the configuration is, which is a little hint for, remember how we talked about convention over configuration? So if you want to go home and be like, I want to really get this stuff, go look at the master POM file, right? And it'll tell you everything. It'll say, this is how we set up the compiler, this is how we set up the jar file, this is how we set up all this stuff, right? The next thing is the settings file. So we haven't really talked about that yet, but in your user directory, in fact, I'll pop over and show it really quick here. So in your user directory, actually I did that really fast. Let's make that. Let's type slower here. Yes, I name all my servers after TV shows. Okay. So here I want to go to my user directory .m2. It's a very important folder in Maven. You'll see two things in this. One, you'll see the repository. This is where all the binaries actually go on your local machine. So when I say, now, I want to use JUnit, right? Or I want to use whatever. I want to use Hibernate, I want to use Spring, I want to do whatever. The libraries all get downloaded and stuck here for me. So you can see all the stuff that just comes along pretty much just by doing basic stuff. But sure enough, here is my MySQL driver. You'll know, 2 different versions. And it's got the POM file in the jar, all that good stuff for me. So once in a while, if you're having problems, you may want to go in here, like blow away the directory. The other file that we have here is the settings.xml file. So what is in here? These are all your configuration options that you want to have for everything that you're doing on your machine, regardless of what project you're using. So the first one up there is central, admin, and the password. So now don't get too excited. It's just an encrypted version of password, because this is my local demo machine. But basically what we're looking at right there is this is how I log into an Artifactory instance, which is just a Maven server that holds files for me. So if you're in an enterprise, you want to go ahead and throw up your credentials to get in the server. And I've overridden the repository locally to take advantage of the fact that I have a local Maven. But I could put in other options here. If I wanted to, I could say something like, okay, by default, I want all my projects to use Java 1.5. I could put that declaration for compiler in here. Now the problem is that means that my declaration won't match anybody else's, right? So then if they go and download, if I'm doing an open source project, I really want people to be able to just say, MVN space test package install whatever and have it work, right? So I don't want to get too much stuff in here, but certainly in an enterprise environment, it's very important. So that's the settings file, and then I have the pom.xml file. So basically, I type in a goal, and the lifecycle runs it, puts all that together, and that's what it's doing.
So is the super pom.xml file a look but don't modify type file?
Do you feel lucky? You can tweak it if you want. It's just sort of like, that's like hacking your kernel or anything else, right? You can do it. Don't. If I say to you, here's my project, and it has Maven 2.1 or 2.0.9 or whatever the version of Maven is, the version of Maven has that in it, and that plus whatever I'm doing together is what gives you your resolved dependencies. So that's where the magic is, right? So if you tweak it, you're effectively creating, Maven 2.0.9.
Right, but are there circumstances where you want to do it there as opposed to somewhere else?
Personally, I can't think of any. That doesn't mean that there may not exist one. I would put changes in my settings.xml before I would go hacking into the super one. So.
Yeah, but you can refer to your own super pom.
Right. So
in fact, I'm using a plugin called FlexMojos to build Flex projects, and I assume that the reason I can still say mvn compile and install and all the same things is because my super pom is referring to a FlexMojos artifact, so that it knows it's using the Flex compiler, not the Java compiler. So,
right. And so basically, there's a couple ways. One, they might have taken their own version of Maven and hacked it, just like we said, right, and given that to you. The other thing is that POM files actually can have inheritance in them.
no, that's what I'm talking about. It's the parent. It's the parent.
Right.
Parent pom.
So, like you saw how on when I did that example a minute ago, I had a sort of a master POM that had 2 modules in it, and then those 2 modules kicked off sub projects.
Right.
You can set up as arbitrarily complex relationships between POM files. So I can have one POM file which depends on another one, overrides the behavior of something else, right? And at some point it gets to be a little bit like operator overloading, where it's like, okay, well it's doing all this stuff, but how the heck is it resolving all this stuff, right? And there is a tool out there that sort of lets you generate an effective POM, so you can actually see what the heck your POM really looks like and what it really is when you resolve all the various properties and options and things like that. It's just like anything else. It's a question of, you know, how far do you want to go with it, right? Like at work, we have a bunch of dependencies, right? I've got about 25 or so, 30 or so dependencies declared. And it's kind of ugly in the XML, you know. And we have similar dependencies between 2 or 3 projects. And so people say, well, maybe we should simplify it and have a super POM that does inheritance or whatever, which means that then they're all kind of bound together and they're tied together and you have to check out more files to do build and things like that. So it's just this constant tension between how complicated do you want your build process to be, how many different things, right? Like right now everybody has to check out a main project, which is where all the like check style and PMD and all those configuration settings live. And that has to sit next to the other directory. So, and that's already too complicated, and if I were willing to bet, people don't probably update that main directory more often than they do rebuild their environment, probably, or someone tells them how to do an update. How often do you update your main memory? Have you done it since you started?
Well, I put this all together a few months ago. I forget the details, but the way I have something set up is there's a master. The thing with the modules in it is actually it's sort of in the parent directory of several libraries and applications.
Yes.
And it's acting both as the master POM and as the parent POM for each of the things. And then it itself has as a parent POM the Flex Mojo's parent POM, which sets up all the compiler options.
Absolutely.
It works out pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's the thing, right? If it works, awesome. It's just a question of how complicated do you want, and does it do what you need to do? The goal that you kind of want to get to, no pun intended, maybe a little bit intended, is that you want to be able to have the installation process for the people who are using it be fairly straightforward and have the commands be fairly intuitive. We actually, when we were working on building out the build process for our stuff, we first did a number of different phases and options. Like when you first look at all the different phases in a life cycle, like you'd say, okay, well there's clean, and then there's compile, and then there's test. And then we tried to bind all the different things that we were doing to all these different portions of the phases. Like we said, okay, well we want to put the database reset and clean, and then we want to put the hibernate property file generation in the generate resources phase, and we want to put this in this phase and that phase. But what we found was that in practice that people had trouble remembering all the different commands that they had to use to be able to get to what they wanted, which was basically I just want my project to work. I want to be able to do MVN, a subversion checkout, do an MVN clean, and then be able to open up my stuff in Eclipse and start working. So it's just, you know, how far do you want to go with it? But absolutely, you can do all sorts of crazy stuff. And so you said that was for Flex?
Yeah.
Very cool. So this was the question about the dependencies. Well, what do I do with dependencies? You have a group, an artifact, a version, and a scope. And then one little tip, the plugins all can have their own dependencies, right? So one of our dependencies, one of our plugins that we have is the ant run plugin, right? So that kicks off a little ant script for us, and we wanted to throw a few more things on the ant path, the ant class path. So in order to do that, we declared the ant optional jar as a dependency in the plugin itself. So you don't just put your dependencies up at that top in the top. Okay, so repositories. So where do all these dependencies come from, and where do they go? So the internet, we always call it the internet, but it's actually, the default one is called iBiblio. And the good folks, I guess with Apache, associated with Apache, set this server up a long time ago, and it's basically this master Maven repository in the sky. And a ton of open source projects have put artifacts up in iBiblio for you. So Hibernate, Spring, those are the short list obvious ones. Name your favorite open source project. There's probably a 50-50 shot that's up there. A couple of notable exceptions. Sun, I guess now Oracle. There are a few jar files that are very popular that are used all the time, like the servlet API, the activation jar, which is one of those like 3K annoyances that you have to have in everything. There's a couple of others, like I think the transaction JTA and a couple of others. So those, because of licensing issues, can't be put up on iBiblio, right? So there's one workaround, which is for your local, where you say, I just want to take this jar file and stick it in my local repository so I have it available. Okay, that's okay, but let's say you're working in a team, right? Well, now I have to set up, every single developer has to then download that jar file and then run the install process themselves. Well, where am I putting the jar file? Well, I guess I'm checking the jar file in the subversion or something, right? So make it easy. So I'm back to the same problem, right? So how do I get around that? That's one issue. The other issue is let's say that we're working together as a team and we're publishing jars for each other, right? I want to be able to say to you, let's say I'm working on the new user setup, right? And someone else is working on billing. So let's say I want to be able to take the new user setup jar and publish that someplace, so that way the billing person can pull that down with their dependency. Well, where do I put that? I probably don't want to put it up on the internet, right? And I probably don't want to, I can't really share my local drive because that's not going to work either. Well, the answer is you get something in the middle, right? Which is basically an internal repository, which is really the answer to the question of where do I put all these artifacts. Now, there's two packages that seem pretty popular out there. One's Artifactory and one's called Nexus. Artifactory is if you're like me and you're really cheap and you want to get a good free one. Nexus is if you want to get a nice paid one. You guys, anybody here using either one of those? Okay, who's using Artifactory? Okay, and who's using Nexus? So yeah, so about half and half both. So hopefully all the bennies at the Nexus, people who work for with the company that paid for Nexus are good.
You ever tried or started out in between with shared keys and publish into an account exposed via Apache? That's kind of what we're doing currently. So our publish cycle for our build system, which is the Luminous Cruise Control, will use the your local settings to identify it as being the build server. It has shared SSH keys, and at the publish target, basically, will SSH copy those after it's generated the SSH1 and the POM identifier and the artifact itself.
Right. So that's just built into Maven, right? Is the deploy command. So the deploy command pushes a file up to a server of some kind, and you can do a couple of different hosting mechanisms. You can do SCP, you can do HTTP put, whatever. So I mean, there's options, right? That's one option.
That's kind of in between because we've got continuous integration anyways. So once it's blessed, effectively, we control our version numbers. So we don't have those up yet.
Yeah. So we've actually automated that as well with Hudson. So the whole release process is automated, including it. We use the Maven plugin, which does a checkout, runs all the tests, does a tag with all the tests run, checks out the separate branch, bumps up all the version numbers in the POMs for us, does all the commits, strips snapshot off, publishes it, and then puts snapshot back on and goes. So our entire release process is now just one click. That does all that.
That's with Hudson plugin.
Actually, it's just Maven. I mean, we automate using Hudson. Actually, funny story on that. When we first turned that on, we had it set up where the release only got kicked off after a good build from the regular tier, right? Well, okay, that sounded really cool. Except the problem is that the release plugin, when it did its work, it checked in an updated POM with a bumped up version number for you automatically, which triggered a new build, which triggered everything. So when we first turned that on and we watched it work a couple times, we were like, oh, awesome, that's great. We go home, drink a beer, go home, whatever. And then come in the next morning and congratulations, we've deployed 50 times because it had just been deploying itself over and over. So what we wound up doing was saying, okay, deploy once every about 4 times a day at, like right before work, at lunch, right after. And then if anybody wants a build cut more often than that, they literally just go into Hudson, click the schedule build, and it just goes down. That's it. Click. So I'm gonna use Artifactory, and that's why for the demo. And like I said, that's just because I'm cheap. But if you have Nexus, or if you want to convince your company to look at Nexus, that's another really good product.
What do those provide over just sticking them? What exactly are those doing? It sounds like Maven is doing the heavy lifting, and all that's doing is an overpriced FTP server.
That's a great question. So I will jump ahead a little bit and show you Artifactory. So this is Artifactory. I have 571 things in here. I've turned on anonymous access. And here you can see that it's set up all these different sub-repositories for me. And sure enough, you can see right here, here's that package. I was going to do a demo of deployment in a little bit. Here we can see pushing out a snapshot. Here's the jar file for that. I could download it. So all this is nice, and it gives you a way to basically have a server that holds your binaries. Right? I mean, that's basically all what this thing's doing. Artifactory you can back with a relational database, so it's very solid. You can schedule automatic backups and things. And let's go ahead and log in and look at the administrative UI.
That tree project browser there looks a lot better than it did like a year ago.
Oh yeah, Artifactory, like
Yeah.
leaps and bounds.
Yeah. I haven't used Maven for about a year, but it was Artifactory was kind of hokey back then a little bit.
Yeah.
It worked, but
Yeah, it's a little slicker now. So repo 1, this is actually where all the things that came up from iBiblio. So just scrolling through here, see XML APIs, a whole bunch of Apache sub-projects, Codehouse, Eclipse, Jetty, Log4j, of course, JDOM. So these are all the different dependencies that are just up there. So you don't have to do anything. You can just declare it, and it'll automatically get downloaded, and you can use it. And there's a search function. Now, okay. So let's take that servlet jar file thing that I mentioned earlier, right? So I could deploy that from the command line if I wanted to. I can also go here into Artifactory, select the jar file, and upload it. And it would ask me to fill in the group and the artifact and the version. I can publish it. So again, really slick way to publish all these jar files. You could, if you wanted to, deploy with this, like even for your own work. But I would recommend just automating it with Hudson and getting on with your life. Then it doesn't have to do anything. Here's where you can actually go in and specify administrative options. Now, here's one that's interesting, global offline mode. So this is a very large philosophical debate we had at work, which was basically the debate boiled down to the IT department initially said, we don't want you to fetch artifacts from the internet, because this thing's basically acting as a proxy, right? The IT department said, we want you to upload every single library by hand that you were going to use. And so that's what this switch would let you do. If I turn this switch on, then this server is the only server that you're going to use. Now, just to give you an idea of why that maybe isn't such a good idea in the big scheme of things, right now our Artifactory instance is serving over 7,000 artifacts. So that's a lot of things that you have to download and track. This is also part of why you have to be really careful about things like not hacking, your Maven Super Palm, because we're trying to maintain at least some hint of predictability. As a side note to that, old versions of Maven used to specify they're in the Super Palm, just grab me the latest version of this thing or that thing. And what that meant is that sometimes when you go to do a build, depending on when you went to do the build, you'd get different results, which suck, right? So that's where this global offline mode thing you can make a case for. Since then, it's basically fallen out as a practice for Maven to specify version numbers without putting the exact number that you want. As long as you put the exact number that you want or you expect for something, and like when I said this deck, remember back here, group, artifact, version, and scope, right? If I specified version as just star, effectively saying grab me whatever the latest, that's when you're going to have problems like that. So nowadays you pretty much won't see anybody do that. You'll see them either specify an exact version number, like 1.2.3, or you might see 1.4.5 dash snapshot. And so dash snapshot is sort of the way of saying, I just want you to go ahead and grab me the latest thing, and go ahead and check every time. The default Maven publishing will not let you publish something that has snapshot dependencies, which is a good thing, right? So that way you kind of get to have your cake and eat it too, but you also get to be really clear when you say, okay, like let's say I'm working on, like I said, the new account setup and somebody else is working on billing, right? The billing person doesn't want to happen to pull in a dependency set just based on whatever came up recently, right? They want to get exactly the same thing. So the deployed thing, if we go back into our factory here, you'll note that there's releases and there's snapshots, right? So snapshots can only get published here. But if I want to publish a release, it can't have a snapshot dependency or a snapshot in the version name. So that's what that snapshot is. So snapshot in the version number. So if I say, here's my snapshot jar, that has a very special meaning, that snapshot. That means that this thing could change on me underneath the covers. So, Artifactory and setting up this intermediate proxy server may seem like just a kind of nice thing to do, but I can't, if you're doing an open source project where you really can just pretty much say everything's going up on iBiblio, and or if you have access to your own repository. Like a lot of people right now on the Google Code stuff that they have set up, because they publish everything with Subversion anyways, there's a way to basically publish into Subversion and use Subversion almost like your own Maven repository. So then they put that as a repository that you can add into a project, which is really cool. So let's say you're working on an open source project and you have like 2 or 3 dependencies that you want to publish as well, because they're just wacky, weird things. Like I was doing this open source project called BeanView for a while, which used annotations to generate both the Swing UI and a Web 2 UI using this framework called Echo, which no one had ever heard of and no one ever uses. So Echo wasn't published to Maven. So it was terribly annoying because the build instructions, half the instructions were just, this is how you install the BeanView libraries. So I could just publish those to any HTTP web server in the right format and cheat and use that as a repository. But generally speaking, if you're in an internal IT company, if you're doing work for a corporation where they don't want you publishing your code, you're going to want to use something like Artifactory or Nexus. Okay, next, last little piece, reporting. So these are some of the plugins that we've been using at All Star. The default one, of course, is just test results. Like I want to see what's going on with Surefire. But there are other ones, like I want to see what my test coverage looks like. I want to go ahead and generate JavaDoc. And I want to put UML diagrams in everything. So we have a plugin that does that. Schema documentation. So we have a lot of 160 plus tables in our stuff. So we use that. Use Schema Spy for publishing that. And stat code analysis. There's a ton of tools out there right now. When I first started this project, I wasn't sure about some of these stat code tools because they always seem vaguely sort of Orwellian to me. And some of the rules seem very particular. And it wasn't until I went and was teaching some guys who hadn't done much Java before how nice it was to be able to put something like check style in and then tell them, go read the check style explanation when it complains about why what you're doing is a bad idea. So we actually wound up even putting check style in as a subversion hook. So you can't even check in now unless you pass check styles errors.
one argues about where the curtain braces go.
Exactly. Well, that's actually one that we turned that one off. Partly because that's the only aesthetic. Okay, so the only thing on this.
That's ironic, really.
I got 20. There's like about 20 or so developers working on this thing. The only thing that I've said by fiat is they have to drop braces, and it's totally this like stylistic silliness that I have because I was a Pascal developer way back when. So that's the only thing that, and everybody basically we just check it in, and there's a standard formatter for it and whatever. And my one sin, confession of sin on this whole project is drop braces, but anyway. The other one, of course, is it looks for things like to-do comments, right? Like everybody goes / to-do. Hey, I gotta go fix this up later. So this generates a nice little report that gathers all those up and finds them. A lot of these things are like, just because you have the tool, use it for good, right? So we did tone down some of Checkstyle's stuff, so it's not, just completely insane. Don't use the / to do as a thing to beat people up. Use it as a way of keeping track of stuff. Sorry, what was that?
Oh, that this is a hack comment.
This is a hack. Oh, totally.
Watch out first, you're not expecting to understand this.
So let's see. So in my thing here, so I put together a little demo example here.
Fix this work.
Okay. So I'm going to run the mvn site command on this particular project. Velocity just takes a moment to fire up. Okay. So let's go ahead. It's going to run and it's going to do its thing. And it took a little bit longer to run than last time. So let's go ahead and scroll up to the top. Okay, so I said mvn clean, which cleaned it out, and then I said mvn site. Right, that's all I did. Now in this little project here, I've bound a few extra things. So velocity is is what it uses to generate documentation by default, and it goes through and fires that up and generates some stuff. And then this is Cobratura. That's a plugin. It does the resources, runs the compiler, and then it does this instrumentation with Cobratura. Runs the test compile, runs test. This is interesting. Normally, the tests do not get run by running the site command. So because I added Cobratura to this, which is a tool that does coverage, now when I say site, it's going to go ahead and run the test for me. Runs the compiler, and then runs the tests, prepares the report, and you'll note it's now also generating a couple other things like this schema spy thing. And it generated this Cobratura report. And it complained a little bit because I'm not on the internet. Okay. Let's look at this and see what we got here. So a few more directories showed up. And now we have this reports down here. So we've got a couple of cool things. We have this Cobratura test coverage report, which looks terrible. Okay, that's pretty awful, but all right. Let's see if we can fix that in a minute. Schema Spy. Now, this is just a demo, so I just pointed Schema Spy at my local MySQL database, which is basically the internals of MySQL. Generated a lot of information for me on this. Now, if I was running this and I had bothered to install the little dot thing, which is a little graphics generator, it would actually generate a clickable graphical representation of my database. Very cool stuff. It's called Schema Spy. It's a great plugin. Highly recommend it. for documenting your database. Now, once you install dot, which is the little executable that you need to do that, you get one other cool feature with another plugin, which is automatically generating UML class diagrams in your Java docs for you. So if you've ever been, well, we need to make sure we have good documentation. You ask them what they mean, and they say, well, everything's got UML diagrams showing what's going on. It's like, okay, fine. Boom, ta-da! Look at all this work I did.
You said the thing's called DOT?
Yeah, it's this weird
DOT?
DOT.
Okay.
It's this weird graphics. Yeah, here.
Isn't it the site package of, I can't remember the name of it.
GraphViz.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's GraphViz. So the executable is part of the GraphViz package, which is this really standard Linux graphing package. So there's a Windows version and there's a Linux version, and you have to put just the right Windows one on for it to work and whatever, but it works and you get beautiful docs. And what's cool is, as you just saw, if you don't include the dot on your path, it'll still run. It just won't generate the graphs, which is really cool because it actually turns out that generating the graphs on 160 tables with all the relationships in a very heavily normalized package, you get a ton of big graphics. So it actually takes 5 to 10 minutes just to generate the graphics on the build environment.
So where did you define the location of the database?
We'll look at that in just a minute when I open up the POM file. Here is my source code, and it's got hyperlinks on it. Now I have a very long piece of code here, but what's cool about this is I can actually literally copy this link, and mail it to somebody and say, look at this exact line in the code. This is really cool. Here's the test results. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is you may think that the tests, the errors, the failures, and the skip rates are actually the most important stuff. It turns out that time is actually one of the really important ones too. We have a lot of tests that people write that are doing integration stuff that take a pretty long time, so it's nice to be able to see that. Tag list, at tag to do, just to add some of those. And here's the test code reference, same thing. Okay, so this is pretty cool little site thing. I didn't include a couple of the other reports that you can get, but let's just take a minute here. And now let's look at, well, how did I get all that stuff? Let's look at the POM file. So in the reporting section, all I did was define all these plugins. So here's the tag list one. That's the one that's generating that list of to-dos. Here's the changes. So this actually will be, if I set this up right, it would show me the changes between one build and the other. Here's Cobertura. Jigsaw, I forget, that's the Java source cross-reference. Here's Surefire, which is generating the test report. And here's Schema Spy. And sure enough, there's the configuration for the database stuff. So what we do at All Star is we actually put the database connectivity. These are actually done, these values come from properties which are set in your settings file. So that way the Hudson build has its own set of databases that it's using. If you're like me and you pretty much just don't really care what OS you use, I happen to use Windows for my builds, for my stuff at work, so I just point to my local host, MySQL instance. There are some people who are doing a lot of stuff with the database where they want to be closer to production, so they run a Red Hat CentOS VM, and then they point to that from their Windows machine. So it's running on their local. Do whatever you want. So a lot of cool stuff with these reports and things. Okay.
And one thing I found that with the Sunfire reports, there's not a lot of details about the tasks that we can, just sort of the name and pass and fail. It'd be great to know a little bit more.
Yeah.
It's basic. But
Well, it'll
that's
show you like problems happen, right?
Right.
Yeah, it'll tell you. It'll tell you what succeeded and failed in the summary report, and then you need to go into this directory, the Surefire reports directory, and it records the output of the tests there. So for this one here, it succeeded, so that's fine. But if it failed through an exception or whatever output, it would put that in here.
Yeah, but I'm more interested in the out of container that maybe, you know.
Like, well, this is running in Maven, so it's not really a container. Like, it's not.
Yeah, but I use it on in other forms, the Sunfire report plugin, and I just struggle with just get the name of the test. They're not descriptive enough. Like, it doesn't give me anything about the test.
Yeah, the reports don't give
And
you
that's
that.
just what.
Yeah,
Have you found anything else that may be more customizable?
No, but I haven't. I mean, to me, it hasn't been a big issue because I can go look at the summary report. It tells me what's succeeding or failing, and then if it fails, I just look at this, right?
Yeah. Which
So,
is- yeah.
yeah, I mean that's all I've got.
Look mysteriously like the default JUnit reports.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what.
So
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
all Surefire is doing, is running JUnit.
Basically, yeah. I don't really know, frankly, why they. There's some other stuff that Surefire is doing, but I don't honestly know exactly what. It's mostly just bindings between Maven and JUnit. Why is it called Surefire? I don't know. There's another plugin called Failsafe that they added, which basically does the same thing, but has defaults for the integration test naming. So whatever. Writing a Maven plugin isn't that bad. They call it a Maven Mojo, or a Maven plain old Java object, which is just a terrible, terrible name, but it's just, that's what it is. So I don't know why they called it Surefire. My guess is that, back in the day when Maven was starting, they probably picked that name, and that's what they went with. Okay. So deployment, you just do MVN. So let's deploy one of these. Of course, I'm going to run my test before I deploy, right? So one click, deploy, now pushed it up into Artifactory. Now I did have to do a little bit of settings work to be able to do that, right? Okay, so that's pretty slick. That's what single command and deploy is. That's what you do when you're starting out. This is the cool one that I mentioned earlier. If you are using Subversion, Hudson or Cruise Control, this one command will do all the steps that you normally have to do a real release. It'll strip the snapshot off, it'll bump the number, it'll tag it in Subversion, it'll check it out, do it, check it in, deploy it, the whole shebang. Where would you go to look for documentation on this? The release plugin, right? Okay, so we are running a little bit short on time, but I'll show you something kind of cool. Okay, so this is my example project, right? So I just created this new SeaJUG project. Sure. Okay. So this is the brand new version of NetBeans. Okay, so I want to open up a project. So here's this SeaJUG project that we just created, the one I just created as a demo for you. I just select it, hit Open Project, and it picks everything up for me. The source is in the right place, the tests are in the right place, the test libraries are there, the project files are there, and you'll note it even went and pulled up my settings out of my .m2 directory and put it down here so I can see what's going on. Pretty cool tooling. let's say I want to update the dependency. So I say, okay, well, JUnit's nice, right? Well, I could go in and I can edit all that stuff in the XML file, or I can just go here, say JUnit, type it in, and say, actually, I want to bump up to version 4.4. Now, it's only going to give me back the versions that I have available locally because I don't have a net connection. But if I had a full connection, hit OK, boom. It's pretty cool stuff, right? Okay, that's NetBeans for you. Yeah.
Is this the version of NetBeans that uses Maven as the default project format? Is that not
I don't.
NetBeans?
Yeah, I mean, basically, native Maven support was the flagship feature in NetBeans 6.7, which just came out. I don't know that if you went to the NetBeans people, if they would say that is their one last stab at the project file format, but it basically is. Like previous versions of NetBeans, I don't know if you ever used it or not, they actually tried to get away with saying that ANT was their default project file format, which was a catastrophe, right? Because think about how many different ways you can put your ANT build scripts together. And if you didn't name everything exactly the way that it wanted, you were toast, right?
Yeah, I saw some NetBeans generated ant scripts, and most of the catastrophe was NetBeans' own doing.
Yeah.
They generated really terrible ant scripts.
Right. Machine generated, right?
Yeah.
It's the nicest thing you can say about it. Yeah. And that's from somebody who used to work on Visual Cafe. Oh well, okay. So that was NetBeans. There's this other development environment that you may have heard of. I'm not going to, now, several people at work are also using IntelliJ. They love it. Like I mentioned before, I'm cheap. So let's go ahead. Fire up Eclipse.
Do that. How many $50 books have you bought this year?
Oh, I don't even want to go there. Not pretty, man. Not pretty. So let's see. So I'm going to import a project, Maven project.
So you're using M2 Eclipse or
Yes, I'm using M2 Eclipse. So sorry, I want to make sure I'm clear on that. There is a plugin called M2 Eclipse. It's an Eclipse plugin, not a Maven plugin. We don't do anything with Maven. In the old days, you used to use the Maven to Eclipse plugin, and then you would run this command, Eclipse, which would generate Eclipse project files. Nowadays, don't do that anymore. Just install the M2 Eclipse plugin into Eclipse, which is what I have here.
Is this only supported on AOM?
A what?
There's a newer plugin called IAM.
Yeah, there are other plugins. I'm using the M2 Eclipse one. I don't want to. Whatever. I mean, there's a bunch of options out
I wasn't
there.
real happy with supporting IAM. I just thought IAM was newer, so I gave it a shot.
It's IAM.
Yeah, IAM.
IAM. Yeah. Yeah, they look like they both had a lot of propaganda about why theirs is slightly better on their sites, but it couldn't tell much difference. So let's go ahead and pull in a Maven project. And on that SeaJUG project. And you'll note that it automatically picked it up. And hit finish. And then it goes ahead and it kicks off a little bit of a test build underneath. And you'll see that in the console. And sure enough, it did the same thing, right? Got my app, my tests. My Maven dependencies now show up here. Let's see, I forget exactly how to get to the Maven, and then I can go in here. This is one of probably the most confusing things from the UI. If I want to get to the Maven commands, I actually have to click on this. So if I want to say, I want to do mvn clean, from inside the IDE or mvn test. I go to the run up here, and I do run as, and so I'm basically running the project, right?
So before you always had to use an external command, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now you can use the
Now it's
regular
just
run
built
as.
in.
Okay, that's cool.
Just like
And then the same thing, I go here and I say Maven, and then I can add update dependencies, open the POM, which is actually one of the neat things. Eclipse took a slightly different, or they have kind of an interesting approach. They actually make the POM file this nice graphical thing. So there's nothing very interesting in here because there's nothing in here. The only thing that's interesting, I guess, at all is the dependencies. And actually, let's look at another project here for this. So this is a little project called the World's Worst App. And so the IT department basically said, tell me all the ways that your Java app could fail. Give us a little app that does all that so we can set up all of our monitoring and stuff. So I said, all right, that sounds like fun. So I just did that on my own personal time so I could keep it and toast it and make it open source or whatever. But it's basically like 20 or so horrible things. It opens up as many database connections as it can. It allocates as much stack as it can. It heap, blah, 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 blah. So,
Permgen space.
What's that?
Permgen space.
Yeah. Oh, I don't have one that's specifically for, oh, I like that. Excellent, more ideas. And so part of the idea was that then you could also experiment with things like JConsole or YourKit to see what fails. So let's look at the POM file for this. So this is actually a little web app that I've got here. And it has a few more dependencies to it. A few more plugins. I've got Jetty hooked in, so I can do run Jetty with one step. And this is kind of interesting. I've got a few more dependencies. You'll note that there's one side over here, which is the hierarchy, and here's the resolved ones. So let's say that you have a situation. Let's take Log4j or one of the Jakarta Apache Commons libraries. I wrote a book on them, so I can bag on them as much as I want. But 10 million little libraries. Who knows what they all do, right? And they're all off by one version, right? This over here is where I can see what was declared and what the hierarchy is for everything. And over here I see what the resolved dependencies are. So let's say that I have one that shows Hibernate needs this version, with this version, with this version, Commons Labs. So it might be even 4 or 5 levels down of dependency. Over here it shows me what the final resolved number is.
So it's like the effective, when you run effective POM, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And of course the dependency graph, which for this project's not that scary.
Cool.
On our projects, which have 75 dependencies in them, it resolves to 75 dependencies.
That's really slick, though, to be able to see it visually like that.
Yeah. So these are some of the tools: NetBeans, Eclipse, Artifactory, Nexus, Hudson. Hudson, of course, if you're using that with Maven, you just say, hey, I've got a Maven project. It recognizes it, knows what to do with it. The repository format, Ivy, right? Like, that's all built off top of this stuff. So is Maven becoming a de facto standard, right? Like, stop and think for a minute here. I just created one project file, and now I can open up an Eclipse, I can open up a NetBeans. I don't have to be a jerk and say, only use the approved IDE, and we can still trade project files with each other. Okay, so All Star Directories. I took our most complicated project, which is our business logic, several conditional builds that we do, one if we're running on top of the exported data migration data, migration tests, a whole bunch of dependencies, all these releases. We release the jar file. We also publish the test classes jar file because we have a couple of other projects that want to use some of our test base framework that we put together. The source code gets attached to the jar, so you get your nice Eclipse. See your source, calculates all the hashes, stamps the subversion number in the manifest, so that way when it gets deployed, right? We do all the database wiping, resetting, and generating of database DB unit fixtures. We generate a ton of documentation. Our Covertura code coverage, which is running at about 85-90% right now, except for internal tools, because Grails generates a ton of template code. All the other stuff, all the schema stuff. How many lines of XML does it take to do all that?
How much would you pay?
Yes, exactly. Price is Right style. Closest without going over, except there's no price. Anyone want to throw a guess at? How many lines of XML?
150?
150. Okay, all right. Anybody else?
75.
75. Wow, I really sold you guys good on this.
400.
400? 350? How many lines of ant would this take?
Jeez. Half a meg.
Ant, what? How many?
You guys must be
Half a
doing
meg?
it wrong.
That's why JBoss 5 took as long to kick out. You guys using Maven or Ant for JBoss right now? Do you know?
Oh, what's that? How many lines of code?
Yeah. Do you know do you know if JBoss is built?
It's built in Hudson with Maven.
Okay.
And there's still some Ant left. We're getting rid of it.
Yeah, exactly. You're
Yeah.
slowly whacking away at it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Anybody else? How many Ant versus how much? So tons of Ant, right? So it actually is, including comments, 786 lines. It's not bad.
No.
And this is how many palms? Is this just one
That's
palm?
just one palm.
Okay.
Right. We probably could have trimmed it down a little bit, except then you're kind of cheating. Like we could have said, well, let's put all the dependencies for 3 projects in the separate thing. So right now we're on that line where we do have some duplicative dependency declarations. I could have cheated, and we probably could have gotten that down to about 500 if we deleted comments, maybe. So Q&A. Unfortunately, we did take up quite a bit of time. I'm going to show you the POM file really quick. I don't think that there's anything too proprietary about it. You can just see exactly what a real production POM file looks like. So we've got our distribution management that's pointing to our where we actually publish. As part of the deployment, we also do publish locally the website. We say that we are going to use UTF-8.
You look at something at the top. At the very top.
Yes.
So the project itself, the very first element,
Yes.
the namespace and all that.
Yep.
Can you explain why there's only version 4 or whatever and a version 2? Version that made
Oh.
it popular.
This is just the Maven XSD. So it's just the schema, the W3 schema.
So does that model version also relate to that? All the same?
I think so, yeah. At some point, it's like all schemas, right? Like if you're not working on it, it's just the magic incantation you put on top, right? And then the autocomplete works, right? The group, the package, the version. Nobody ever touches the version because you'll know it gets auto-incremented every time there's a release. The name, the URL, the distribution. That's how it knows where to publish. We say everybody's using UTF-8, which maybe or may not be true, but whatever. It's the intent, at least. This is very important. Those SCM configuration, if you want to do that automated release, that's where that goes. I see a ton of people throw random junk in there because they don't know what it means. That's what that's for.
What's that supposed to do?
This is how it knows what the path is for where your project is located in Subversion.
Okay.
Right? So that way when you do the automated release command I mentioned earlier, it knows where to tag, where to check out, right? And so you want to make sure that you have a standard Subversion layout too, which is also another thing that
Oh, okay.
you could
I was
have
going to
shot.
say, because I don't see anything in there that tells me where to put tags.
Exactly, because it's going to use the version number at the top for the tag by default.
And put it where? In the tags subdirectory?
Yeah. Yeah.
So in other words, the section of the Subversion document that says you don't have to, but we recommend.
Yes.
That's why they recommend.
Yeah, because it's another convention, right? Yeah, I mean, it's like everything else here. You know, if I wanted to, I could set up Maven to throw my source code in some random directory, my test code in something. I could put a bunch of files, God knows where I want. I could do all that, right? And then I'd be up to 3,000 lines of XML, and I'd be back to Ant. Only it's worse, because now it's Maven, and right, the learning curve's a little worse. So, you know, this stuff, you want to stick with the conventions, right? There's a reason for them. The problem is knowing them. So there's a definite bias here towards, you know, frankly, knowing what you're doing. You know, paying attention to it, reading the book, reading up the material. You guys are all seasoned Java developers, so you can get where you were by just being handed something to you, right? I can insert the cheap shot about a VB developer here, right? Okay, this is where we're doing Maven. This is something that I would like to remove and replace with a Mojo, right? Because right now I'm using the exec command, which is a total hack. So I'm just saying run the Maven or the MySQL command line and then load the SQL file.
What is profile?
What's that?
Those are under a profile section. What is the profile section?
Profiles is how you do conditional builds. I talked about briefly. Profiles are really cool because what you can do is you can define them, and then you can also make simple declarations like only do this, only activate this profile if I'm running on Windows. Only activate this profile if I'm running on a certain version of the JDK. Only activate this profile if a certain file exists. There's a lot of really complex, cool conditional stuff that you can do with profiles very easily. So this particular profile here is the data export one. And so what this is doing, you look all the way down here, is it's loading in this SQL file that has in it the contents of the data from the data migration team. So this one command takes about 5-10 minutes to run, and it's loading a huge amount of data.
How's it triggered?
You do MVN-P to activate the profile and then the ID. And you can activate multiple profiles on it with a comma. So that's exactly what we do. We activate that one, and then we also have another one here, which is run integration. Now, integration's really funny because the strict definition of an integration test is a test that relies on another resource, right? An external resource, right? Now, the problem is let's say I'm working on writing Hibernate criteria queries, for example. Well, I could mock all that out, but that's a pain in the arse, right? What's the point? So instead, what we sort of kind of have done is we've defined an integration test as a test that takes more than a second or two to run, right? And we didn't want to put, run slow test because everybody agreed that would just seem horrible. But the other thing, now, super common FAQ for using Maven, I would like to allocate more memory to my tests, right? So invariably what everybody does is they start hacking away at their Maven batch files, right? Trying to add memory to Maven, right? And dang it, it doesn't work. What the heck is going on? Well, the reason is that you want the Surefire plugin to get more memory.
Right. It's the one.
Because it's the plugin actually kicks it off on its own separate VM thread. VM, right? So
You should specify the min as well, it will start up faster.
what's that?
If you specify the min heap as well, it will start up faster because it won't churn reallocating the heap.
Oh, yeah.
Little bump, little bump.
If you're going to allow it to have a gig, just give it a gig from the start.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do it once.
For the integration test, they already take forever, a couple seconds. That's a good tip. So here you can see dependency declarations, task scope. Okay, here's a cool one. So here's a transitive dependency override. So my understanding is that this was bumped up a little bit to fix a dependency issue, right? To fix a version numbering conflict between what number do we need and what number do we want, right? Like, let's say that we really want to be using the version 1.4 of that JUnit add-ons library. It got dragged in by something else, let's say a version 1.2, but we really wanted to use 1.3, so we declare it in this file. That's the tip. The closer it is to the project file, that's the dependency you're going to get. So you can see there's a lot of dependencies. That's the bulk of this file, actually. Spring, Java Mail.
Do you end up hand typing all this? Or can you point and click and then generate the next one for you?
Yeah, you can point and click and have it generate it. Personally, I'm the sort of person who I type them all in one at a time. Mostly because I kind of don't really want to increase the dependency tree that much. So for me, it's like, well, if I type it in by hand, I'm going to be more particular.
You're going to be totally in control.
You can go in between, and there's, I think it's mvnrepository.com for searching for artifact projects and artifact tags, and it'll give you the dependency code to plug right in if you want to pull in some framework or something.
So why do the developers walking down the hallway cuss underneath their breath about Maven, and that they're scared to go to it, and it's very complicated, and they wonder why they should? And
Well, because of convention over configuration, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing that makes like,
There's a lot of hidden little things in there they just don't know about that bite them.
yeah, it's kind of like, the rail, like, the Rails thing where it's like, well, you don't know how that works? What are you, stupid?
Right.
It's like, well, no, nobody told me that if I type in these 3 magic characters in this one file, it does this thing. That's exactly what's going on here. And number one, and number two, nobody knows how to read the docs because they're not used to thinking, okay, well, if I want to do this thing, I go read the documentation. So here's the test jar, right? So all we're saying right here is when I do generate the jar file, I also want a test jar. That's all this is saying, right? But in order to know what's going on, you have to be able to know how to read the documentation for that plugin and do the configuration, right? So it's sort of like this
Endless.
yeah, I don't know what's going on. I don't understand. You know, it's freaking me out. It's another XML file format. I'm so sick of editing XML files. And I don't want to be a build engineer when I grow up either, right? Like that's part of it too, frankly. You know, it's much easier, especially at most organizations, especially if you have the build guy, right? So you've been doing Ant, and it's like, oh my God, it sucks. And we just finally brought in Billy, who's this like, you know, young guy that, you know, got stuck with this job, and he's maintaining our Ant scripts for us. Whenever there's a problem, it's his problem. That's the way most people kind of treat this stuff, right? So like, you know, oh wait, I have to take responsibility for learning this stuff and knowing how it works. This is my project file now. I have to really know what's going on. Oh, that's hard, right?
What about an existing Ant infrastructure and everybody gets all wild about Maven? That's where I'm usually hearing it in the context of it's a big transition.
It is. It is a big transition because everybody homebrewed it, right?
Right.
So the proper approach to that, I would say, is the only thing that you really care about is your Java code, right? Start from there, create your Maven project, and then go on from there and start adding in bits and pieces, right? Your worst case scenario would be to say, okay, I've got, and this is a really common one, right? One Maven project file, one artifact. Project file produces a jar, project file produces a war. Do not try and take one Maven project file and produce a jar file and another jar file and a war file. That's a big one. And so some people, they say, well, here's my Ant thing, I want to convert it over. My Ant script produces 3 jars in a war file and the SAR, service archive,
Service archive,
and it produces a EAR, right? So I know all those things to get stitched together. Don't do that.
Right.
Right.
Split them up into individual palms.
Exactly.
Then weave them together how you want.
Right. And Maven even supports something called taking multiple POM files together and merging. And that would be my cue that we're wrapping up, right? Oh, okay.
We got time.
Okay. Let's say 40. I guess we get to line.
So
Yes.
isn't the main issue, because we're using it, and you mentioned it, it would be nice if you share the development
I don't know that I can give you, so I don't think I can give you the POM file that we use at my company. I can strip it down and remove a few things.
like the interesting
Yeah.
part about the plugins and stuff.
Absolutely. And to be honest, actually, I probably could, right? Like, the biggest issue probably is some of the specifics about some of the dependencies and things, because, you know, I'm sure our IT department would view what version of the library we're using as a big security thing or something like that. Whatever. But, like, yeah, I mean, there's nothing in here, right?
You can take all the versions out.
Yeah, I mean, I'll strip
You can put it
out.
on your worst app.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know, from a security standpoint, that all fits the bill, right?
yeah, absolutely. The worst app would be fine. For this, there's no passwords in this POM file. It's a project file, right? All the passwords and things are in the settings.xml file. So there's nothing in here that's actually that sensitive beyond the version numbers of the libraries that we're using, frankly.
But you know, the complication that we have is, so you start using a class and you have unresolved records.
Yes.
So where is what is the artifact ID, what is the jar, what is the which repository holds it, what is the version you're supposed to have?
Right.
It takes you 3 hours to do that.
Yeah. Well, it does, except.
Is there a way to get that?
Absolutely.
Can you repeat the
There
question? I
are-
couldn't hear.
Yeah, that was, you couldn't hear the comment over on the other side of the room. But so this is one of the really cool things about Maven standardizing things, is that there are now at least 3 sites that I know of that indexed the Maven repositories. And because the POM files are published along with everything else, including the jar files and everything else, it's very easy to write a little crawler that goes through, looks for all the POMs, looks for all their dependencies, looks for all the classes, and where are they, what POM files are they declared in. So you can actually go up into 3 different sites now, paste in the name of a class, like com.foo.bar or whatever, paste it in, hit go, and it'll tell you what POM file, what artifact group and that version number has that class that you're looking for. Yeah, I can add those up. Yeah, I don't have it right in the bookmarks. Yeah. Well, and you I think somebody over here, was it, you mentioned the, yeah, what's it? The names of the search engines that do jar indexing and whatever. MVNrepository.com or something? Okay.
Take our name. Search for it in Google with Maven on it. Take you right there.
Yeah, that, or iBiblio. If it's up on iBiblio, just put in iBiblio and then you'll. The other thing is these are all, so the UI on this is a little bit nicer, but here. All of these are, all of the repositories, all of the Maven repositories are just a web server, right? So this one, Artifactory, it's a nice fancy UI on it. You know how by default you just get that file directory view out of Apache, right? Most of them have that. So the URLs are highly hackable. So, you know, hello Schema Spy. So this is the Schema Spy plugin, right? This URL is highly hackable, and so it's actually the exact same path that you would find on iBiblio or anything. So one of the common things that you'll do is, okay, well there's this plugin and I want to get the most current version. So I'll go to the site, maybe with a version that was in some example doc, and I'll trim the version number off, look up a little bit higher in the path, and see if there's been a more recent version published, and then I'll try that one.
Could you just review the practices for releases again? And like if you weren't doing a site, if you were just doing a library, a jar that you wanted to share with other groups in the company, but you kind of wanted to give it an official version number, not a stamped subversion build number, but just like, oh, this is version 1.3 of my library.
Correct.
You know, how would you go about that?
Well, there's 2 ways to do it, right? There's one way, which is manually, doing a release, right? So if I'm going to do a release manually, what I would do is at its most basic is, I just go into this POM file and I remove snapshot, right? Save the POM file, and then run the deploy command, right? So let's go ahead and do that really fast on this simple jar, right? So I would like to deploy simple jar release. Okay, so let's go into Artifactory, browse, tree browser, and here's the example that I just published, right? Well, okay, I'd like to publish, actually, let's go ahead and do it. Let's try this here. If I can do it. Yeah, well, Eclipse doesn't have deploy built in.
So it wasn't reading the POM.
Yeah. What's that?
It wasn't reading the goals. POM.
No, it doesn't read the goals from the POM. The goals come from just from the plugin, and you can specify it. All right, let's do it from Eclipse. So run as, but I want to do a run configuration. So I don't want to just do one of these. Right, my goal is deploy. Right? Okay, let's try it.
So you're deploying snapshot there?
Yep. And let's just make sure it worked. Oh, I didn't put the deployment options in. So let me copy in. It doesn't know. What it just said was, okay, you want to deploy this thing? I have no idea where. So let's open up the POM file for my little Julia child pre-cooked example here.
No, there's a distinction between deploy and install.
Correct.
Those are two different places that it can be deployed to.
There are three commands that you want to keep in mind. Package. Package just puts it in your target directory. Install takes whatever was packaged and puts it in your local repository. And then the third one is deploy, which is put it in the server up there.
Okay.
So I'm going to go just copy off for my example here. Oh, freaky. Limitations to it.
Screwing up his cut and paste.
Nice.
Ah, Max.
Someone's got one.
Jeez, Max.
Yeah, I'm sure Nick Clips had nothing to do with that.
Exactly.
I just had to say that. It's the first time I've ever heard it say
I think that seems to really be hot on. Cut and paste is a futuristic feature,
Yeah.
given their asset.
Now with cut and paste. All right. So, I'm just going to do it from the command line files. So I just pasted in from the other project, the local artifactory is the thing I want published in. So, it just published it, right? This simple jar file. So it just uploaded it and published it. So, now if we go in here, so it showed up as org SeaJUG simple jar, right? Because that was what we had. So now we want to deploy it as a release, right? Okay, well if I was really chintzy about it, right, all I would do is just open this up and say, 5.0.
Progress.
Progress. And it's complaining because I don't have the right pathing bit here because I must have only given it a snapshot. Yeah. I told it I was only going to publish this thing to a snapshot, so that's why it's complaining. So, of course, I do want to actually publish this to my releases local.
So the name is
Name needs to be different, yeah.
Actually, the name doesn't really matter. Okay.
Usually doesn't.
Worked. Okay. Now we go back over here, refresh. Here's a bright and shiny version 5.0.
And when you deploy it, it installs it and deploys it, right? So it updates your local.
That's a good question,
Sorry.
actually. I've never bothered. Yeah, it does the install.
Okay. Because I mean,
Does
your
the
local
install
can be
and-
viewed as a cache as well, right? And so it needs to get.
Right. So, so if I do... So there's the jar file, right? The snapshot and the regular one. Why is the snapshot still there?
Well, it's gonna be.
Because you haven't removed it.
Because I haven't removed it, right? I didn't run clean. Now, there's one problem with this, right? I just built a jar file with the same version number, right? So that was kind of ugly. So what should I do? Well,
You should do what Sun does and silently publish it without telling people that you changed the build.
yes. Well, besides that, I'm not as cool as Sun. I mean, Oracle. Oh wait, never mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because they had some embarrassing thing they didn't want to
So
talk about.
in order to get it working back to what I'm really doing, which is I'm now on SimpleJar 5.0.1 snapshot, I had to go back into the POM file and edit it by hand. Now, if your release process includes updating the POM file, tagging it, right, checking it in, checking it out, running all the tests, blah, 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 you can see where that can become a time-consuming, error-prone process, which is why you go back to, it really makes sense to just go ahead and go back to this, right? That command. If you do that command, it'll do the whole thing for you automatically. It will bump the last number in your POM file for you, strip the snapshot, actually strip snapshot, publishes it, right? Again, I would read up on the documentation on that on the release.
So that's the command at the bottom that you're talking about?
Yep.
Basically that whole line?
That whole line, batch mode, is a magic command, eh? So where could you look for documentation on what that does to this? Is in the plugin, right?
Google.
So this is actually technically a Maven option, right? But basically, yeah.
Now, the one thing I found helpful was using help. I mean, this was like a long time ago on specific commands like that, and then it would dump out a bunch of documentation about it.
Yeah. The problem with that is that means you already have a plugin,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So if you're using a plugin that you don't have.
But then, like for the parameters that you needed to enter in there and stuff like that, right? The name of them and all that junk.
Maybe a dumb question, but now you've got all this stuff in Artifactory, labeled with the version number and everything.
Yep.
What are the options for non-Maven systems to get it out of Artifactory? Say you've got to build an installer and you have to basically be running the Maven command to just fetch some labeled thing from Artifactory. Or
Yeah, you can do that. You could use Ivy and AND, wget. You could use wget. Yeah, I mean you can use anything you want. It's just a file hosted to a web server. That's all it is to anybody else. You know, if you use Ivy, then it knows how to do magic for pathing for you, and it'll do something smart with the POM file or whatever. But otherwise, it's just a jar file with a path. And that's exactly what our IT department has done. So all things that we do are published through Artifactory, and that's where IT goes to get everything that we publish. They just go up to Artifactory.
The cool kids use curl now, not the
Cool kids use curl. Hey, I was talking about doing programming on my 64K pet.
Did you say you need like 3 or 4 projects?
So if you want to build an EAR, right? So the building of the EAR itself, that's one project. But then the EAR is going to be composed of other things, right? So each one of those other things should be its own project. And so then you can declare the dependencies really easily, right? Like a WAR file is just another thing that you can have as a dependency on something else, right?
So we could
We could publish the world's worst app WAR file right into Artifactory, right? If we want to.
Yeah, I think that should become a new benchmarking app, you know, and see how well you can deal with it or something.
Actually, you know, it was funny. I will say this. So this is
There you go.
definitely.
World's worst app.
Yeah,
Forget
actually.
Petsima. How fast can you run the world's worst app?
CD workspace. Actually, you know something? This is a totally unsolicited thing, but so we're using JBoss 4.2x, whatever, the version that we buy.
Yeah.
And I'll go ahead and fire up Worst App on Jetty in a sec.
Yeah.
But when I gave the world's worst app to the IT department, they actually said that they couldn't bring JBoss down.
Couldn't bring it down.
Couldn't bring it down with the world's worst app.
Wow.
So
I gotta get that in writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm pretty sure all you have to do is add the perm gen thing.
Yeah, Jim will kill it in about 10 seconds. You know what though? 1.6 and
So here's something fun. So this is the last thing. I guess we're basically done. If you guys want to see World's Worst App, because it's kind of funny, I'm going to build it right now. So this is kind of neat. I actually have tests that run that do all the horrible things, but then it's all wrapped in exception blocks, so it does its thing. And then what I just did here was I added the Jetty plugin to Maven. So then the command I gave was Jetty run. And you'll notice I did Jetty : run, just like the plugin name. And that's what brought this up. So here's the worst app, and you can see all the different fun, horrible things that it does. Built with Maven, all the horrible things are done with tests, mostly. There's a few of them that do love unit tests.
Do you put any recursive function?
But I like them. Oh yeah.
Stack.
Fill up the heap on the stack. Kablooey!
You need an infinite loop in the startup scripts for the servlet.
Couldn't kill it.
Actually, you want to see the one that I thought was just horrible? This is the last thing you want your server to do. Right? I mean, it doesn't. Okay, so I wrote that test and it was like, well, it still worked. That's horrible. Okay. So then this is the one, and this is a great thing to end our day on, right? So this is going to have the server open up as many windows as possible.
I've got to get a copy of this. You got to give me a copy. I got this. This would be a great demo app.
So it's going to try it. Let's see, is it working? Is it going to do it?
What'd you click on again?
Yeah, it just killed it. So Jetty killed it, but when on the JBoss one, apparently when they
What was the test? What'd you do?
it tried to open up as many AWT windows as it could. It just created a little loop firing off AWT windows. And you may say, well, it's a server. Why the hell would I ever do that, right? But
Well,
if
never
I had
know.
charting or something like that.
I used to
but
do that with sockets on a Sunbox. See how many sockets it could open up before it blew up.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're
2000.
lucky you could run out of graphics context
Was
before that
it
would actually
JDK?
crater.
Yeah,
Wasn't
so
it JDK5 they fixed that so you could do graphics operations without having to
Yes,
have
it's in the background.
X server installed on
And
your.
let's say
It's in memory, but it's
Yeah.
not visual.
Yeah.
So this is gonna. So I fired because I was able to kill Jetty with it. They had it, I think, with some sort of buffer thing. So we're basically done. Unless there's anything else.
All right, I guess with that, thank you, Will. Thank you for your presentation.